When people talk about avoidant attachment, they usually make one mistake. They assume silence means indifference. They assume distance means the connection is gone. They assume if someone pulls away, they stopped caring. But that's not how an avoidant mind works. And that misunderstanding ruins many relationships that still had emotional intensity beneath the surface. Hughes often explains that people reveal the truth of their emotions less through what they say and more through what they repeatedly do under stress. That matters with avoidants, because avoidants are rarely honest with their own emotional state. They can feel deep attachment and still act cold. They can miss someone intensely and still refuse to send one text. Their nervous system interprets closeness as pressure, so the very thing they want becomes the thing they resist. The strongest sign an avoidant cannot stop loving you is not that they confess it. It is not that they suddenly become emotional. It is not that they chase dramatically. The strongest sign is that they keep returning psychologically, emotionally, or behaviorally after periods of withdrawal. They orbit back. This return matters more than words because avoidants are experts at rationalizing distance. They will tell themselves the relationship was wrong. They will convince themselves they need space. They may even act certain that moving on is best. But if the attachment bond is still active, they keep circling back. They reappear with random messages. They check your social media. They ask mutual friends about you. They create reasons to reconnect that seem casual, but are not casual. This is not coincidence. This is emotional gravity. Why does this happen? Because avoidants do not stop attachment the same way secure people do. Secure people process loss directly. They feel pain, reflect, grieve, and eventually integrate. Avoidants suppress. They bury the feeling. They distract themselves. They seek independence as relief. But suppressed attachment does not disappear. It waits. And when something reminds them of safety, familiarity, or emotional intensity, it resurfaces stronger than before. That is why an avoidant may leave, go silent, appear unaffected, and then months later act strangely present again. They are not always trying to restart the relationship consciously. Many times they are responding to unresolved emotional activation. Their system is checking if the bond still exists. It is like touching a bruise to see if it still hurts. Most people misread this. They think if an avoidant comes back, it means they are ready. Not necessarily. Returning does not mean healed. It means the emotional bond remains active. Those are different things. Someone can love you deeply and still be incapable of healthy intimacy. This distinction protects people from false hope. An avoidance love often shows in contradictions. They may say they need freedom, but become uneasy when you move on. They may act detached, but remember details no one else notices. They may avoid serious conversations, but react intensely when they sense you are emotionally leaving. That reaction is revealing, because avoidants often ignore what they feel until they perceive permanent loss. The threat of losing access forces hidden attachment to the surface. Watch what happens when you genuinely stop chasing. This is where truth appears. If the avoidant has no emotional investment, your absence creates relief and closure. But if they cannot stop loving you, your withdrawal changes them. They become restless. Their behavior becomes inconsistent. They may lurk online, initiate vague contact, or create low-risk excuses to reconnect. Their pride stays strong, but their distance becomes unstable. This instability is important. Stable detachment looks final. Unstable distance looks like someone fighting themselves. They are torn between attachment and self-protection. That inner conflict is the fingerprint of avoidant love. Another overlooked sign is emotional memory. Avoidants may appear disconnected, but they store emotional moments deeply. If months later they reference a small conversation, a phrase you once said, a shared joke, or a private memory, that is significant. Avoidants do not revisit emotional details casually. If those memories remain accessible, the bond remained active in their internal world. They kept replaying parts of the connection long after silence. There is also something many missers avoidants test emotional access. They may send a simple message that seems meaningless. How have you been? I saw something that reminded me of you. On the surface, this looks harmless, but psychologically it is often a test. They are measuring whether the emotional door is still open. Not because they are manipulative by default, but because vulnerability terrifies them. They test before they risk. This is why the strongest sign is return without necessity. No practical reason. No urgent example. Hughes, just emotional reentry. They had every opportunity to stay gone, yet some part of them kept moving back toward you. That movement is attachment acting against avoidance. But there is one more layer. Avoidants often do not return because they solved anything. They return because separation did not erase the bond. The nervous system still associates you with emotional significance. You became part of their regulation patterns, someone they both fear and crave. That combination creates powerful internal conflict. The person becomes symbolic. You are no longer just a partner. You represent comfort, risk, exposure, safety, and loss at the same time. That is why avoidants can seem obsessed and distant simultaneously. They may think about you constantly and still remain silent. Their silence is not proof of peace. Sometimes it is proof of fear, fear of dependence, fear of rejection, fear of needing someone who can affect them deeply. The people who understand this best do not chase for validation. They observe patterns, because patterns expose truth faster than promises. If someone repeatedly exits and re-enters your emotional space despite having the option to disappear, something unresolved remains. And in many avoidants, that unresolved feeling is love they do not know how to hold. The mistake is assuming love guarantees change. It does not. Love can exist beside immaturity. Love can exist beside avoidance. Love can exist beside emotional unavailability. This is why recognizing their feelings is not the same as building a future with them. Awareness matters. Boundaries matter more. If an avoidant cannot stop loving you, the evidence is rarely loud. It is subtle repetition, returning, watching, remembering, testing, reacting when you detach. These behaviors show the emotional bond survived their withdrawal. Because for avoidance, love often hides in the very distance people misunderstand. The space is not always absence. Sometimes it is where their strongest emotions are buried. Avoidants often hide attachment instead of expressing it openly, and this is one of the most misunderstood parts of human behavior. Most people expect love to look obvious. They expect affection to come with words, consistency, reassurance, and visible effort. But with avoidant people, attachment can exist beneath behavior that looks distant, cold, or even indifferent. What appears to be emotional absence is often emotional suppression. They may feel deeply connected to someone and still act as if nothing is happening, because closeness activates discomfort they have spent years learning to escape. Chase Hughes discusses how behavior under internal conflict often reveals more truth than spoken language. That applies strongly here. Avoidants can care intensely while simultaneously resisting the natural urge to show it. They learned early that depending on others can feel unsafe, unpredictable, or emotionally costly. Because of that, when attachment forms, their instinct is not always to move closer. Their instinct may be to pull away to regain a sense of control. This confuses the other person because the emotional signal and the visible behavior appear opposite. An avoidant may think about someone constantly, miss them, replay conversations, and feel emotionally tied, yet still refuse to reach out. They may draft messages and delete them. They may check social media but never interact. They may ask about someone through indirect channels but pretend complete disinterest when given the chance to speak directly. To an outside observer, this looks like mixed signals. To the avoidant, it feels like managing internal exposure. They are trying to contain vulnerability while attachment continues underneath. This is why many people wrongly assume that distance means the connection is gone. In avoidant attachment, distance is often a defense against emotional intensity. When feelings become stronger, many avoidants do not lean in, they become quieter. They become harder to read. They focus on work, distractions, routines, or independence. They may convince themselves they need space when what they actually need is emotional safety. The person they care about becomes the source of both comfort and pressure, and that contradiction creates withdrawal. What makes this especially confusing is that avoidants rarely communicate this inner conflict clearly. They may not fully understand it themselves. They interpret emotional dependence as loss of freedom, so even genuine love can trigger resistance. They want connection, but fear what connection demands. They want closeness, but the intimacy makes them feel exposed. As a result, they often hide attachment not because it is weak, but because it feels powerful enough to threaten the emotional distance they rely on. This hidden attachment reveals itself through patterns, not declarations. They remember details long after conversations end. They return after silence. They react strongly when they sense the other person moving on. They notice changes, milestones, or emotional shifts even while acting detached. These signs matter because they show that the bond remained active in their internal world. They were not disconnected, they were guarding themselves. The hardest part for others is recognizing that emotional concealment is not emotional absence. An avoidant may appear calm while privately struggling with attachment they do not know how to express. They may stay silent while feeling everything. And that silence is what leads many people to misunderstand just how much was there all along. Distance does not always mean emotional detachment, and this is one of the most critical misunderstandings in relationships involving avoidant attachment. People often interpret physical or emotional withdrawal as a clear signal that feelings have disappeared. They assume that if someone is not texting, not initiating contact, or not emotionally present in a visible way, then the bond must be weakening. But in reality, especially with avoidant attachment patterns, distance can be a coping mechanism rather than a reflection of emotional loss. When someone has an avoidant emotional style, closeness can feel overwhelming even when love is present. The nervous system associates intimacy with pressure, expectation, or loss of autonomy. So when feelings intensify, the natural response is not always to move closer, but to step back. This step back is not necessarily a decision to disconnect it. It is often an unconscious attempt to regulate internal discomfort. The emotional connection may still be intact, even while behavior suggests separation. Hughes often emphasizes that human behavior under stress is more revealing than verbal statements. In avoidant dynamics, stress is often triggered by emotional closeness. So when someone withdraws, it is not always because they feel nothing. It can be because they feel too much at once and do not know how to process it in real time. Distance becomes a form of emotional breathing space rather than emotional ending. What makes this even more confusing is that avoidants rarely communicate this process clearly. Instead of saying, "I feel overwhelmed, but I still care," they simply become less available. They may reduce communication, delay responses, or create physical distance. To the other person, this looks like fading interest. But internally, attachment can still be active. The bond does not disappear just because expression is reduced. In many cases, distance actually intensifies internal reflection. When avoidants step away, they are not always moving on, they are often trying to regain emotional balance. During that space, memories, feelings, and unresolved attachment can surface more strongly. However, because they are not expressing it outwardly, others assume it is gone. This mismatch between internal experience and external behavior creates one of the most painful misunderstandings in relationships. Distance can also serve as a form of self-protection. If an avoidant person feels emotionally exposed, they may create space to avoid vulnerability. But protection does not equal disconnection. A person can care deeply while simultaneously avoiding situations that intensify emotional exposure. In fact, the stronger the attachment, the stronger the need for distance can become. This paradox is what makes avoidant behavior so difficult to interpret correctly. Another important factor is that avoidants often process emotions internally rather than relationally. Instead of seeking reassurance or closeness during emotional intensity, they retreat inward. They think, analyze, suppress, and regulate on their own. From the outside, this looks like disappearance. But internally, processing is still happening. The emotional thread remains even if it is not visible in communication or behavior. The mistake many people make is equating consistency of contact with consistency of feeling. But in avoidant dynamics, those two do not always align. Someone may care deeply and still struggle to maintain closeness. They may think about the person often, but still avoid reaching out. They may feel connected but still choose silence as a way to manage internal discomfort. This is why distance should never be the only measurement of emotional detachment. Real detachment is shown through absence of emotional reaction, absence of internal relevance, and absence of re-engagement over time. But when someone returns, reacts, or remains subtly influenced by the connection even after space, it suggests the emotional bond was never fully gone. Distance, in many avoidant patterns, is not the end of connection. It is often the way they survive connection they do not yet know how to hold. Their strongest feelings usually appear through indirect behavior, and this is where avoidant attachment becomes especially difficult to interpret. People tend to look for love in direct expressions. Clear communication, emotional openness, verbal reassurance, and consistent presence. But with avoidant patterns, the most significant emotions are often displaced into behavior that does not look emotional on the surface. Instead of saying what they feel, they show it through patterns, timing, hesitation, and re-engagement. When someone has an avoidant emotional structure, direct vulnerability can feel exposing. Expressing deep feelings openly may trigger internal discomfort, because it creates a sense of dependency or loss of control. So instead of stating emotions, they unconsciously reroute those emotions into indirect actions. These actions are not random. They are structured responses to internal attachment that they are not fully comfortable acknowledging. Hughes often highlights that behavior under emotional tension reveals more truth than language alone. This is especially relevant here. Avoidants may not articulate their feelings, but their behavior can still broadcast emotional intensity if you know what to look for. The challenge is that the signals are subtle, inconsistent, and often misinterpreted as disinterest rather than hidden attachment. For example, instead of saying, "I miss you," an avoidant may reappear after a long silence with a neutral message that seems casual on the surface. Instead of expressing longing, they may send something indirect like a memory trigger, a short check-in, or a reference to something shared in the past. The emotional content is not in the words themselves, but in the timing and return. The fact that they re-enter the connection at all is often more meaningful than what they say once they are back. Indirect behavior can also appear through observation rather than interaction. An avoidant may watch from a distance, view updates, or stay aware of someone's life without directly engaging. This is not always intentional in a calculated sense. Often, it is an emotional pull they do not fully act on. They are connected enough to remain interested, but guarded enough to avoid direct vulnerability. So the connection becomes observational rather than expressive. Another form of indirect emotional expression is inconsistency. When someone leaves and returns repeatedly, it is rarely random. It often reflects internal emotional conflict. The avoidant part pushes away to regain control, while the attachment system pulls them back toward familiarity. This push-pull cycle is not just behavioral instability, it is often emotional intensity trying to find a safe expression point. Even silence can be indirect communication. A sudden withdrawal after closeness is not always detachment. It can be emotional overload. The absence of communication can be a response to internal activation, not absence of feeling. What looks like shutting down may actually be emotional containment. The feelings are still present, but they are being held internally rather than expressed outwardly. Indirect behavior is also visible in sensitivity to loss. An avoidant may appear indifferent until they sense genuine emotional distance from the other person. At that point, their behavior can shift subtly re-engagement, checking in, or emotional probing disguised as casual interaction. This reaction is not always conscious manipulation, it is often the activation of attachment once the threat of permanent loss becomes real. The key to understanding this pattern is recognizing that avoidant attachment rarely disappears, it hides. It moves from expression to behavior, from words to patterns, from openness to indirect signals. Their strongest feelings do not vanish, they change form. They become timing, distance, return, hesitation, and observation. What makes this so complex is that indirect behavior is easy to dismiss. People assume that if love is real, it must be clear and verbal. But in avoidant dynamics, emotional truth often sits underneath the surface layer of behavior. The feelings are not absent, they are encoded differently. And unless you understand that language, you may miss the fact that the strongest emotions were never gone, they were simply never spoken directly. Avoidants struggle with vulnerability, not necessarily love, and this distinction is essential for understanding their emotional world accurately. Many people confuse emotional distance with emotional absence, assuming that if someone cannot express vulnerability, they must not feel deeply. But in avoidant attachment patterns, the issue is rarely a lack of feeling. It is the difficulty of tolerating exposure while those feelings exist. Vulnerability requires a person to be seen without control, to allow emotional dependence, and to risk rejection or overwhelm. For someone with an avoidant structure, this can feel destabilizing rather than comforting. They may experience closeness as pressure, not because they do not care, but because care itself activates a fear of losing autonomy or being emotionally engulfed. So the stronger the emotional bond becomes, the more threatening vulnerability can feel, even when love is present. Hughes often explains that stress does not erase emotion, it distorts its expression. This applies strongly to avoidant behavior. Under emotional stress, avoidants tend to shift away from openness and towards self-protection. They may reduce communication, avoid deep conversations, or change the subject when emotions intensify. This does not mean the feeling is absent. It means the feeling is not being expressed in a direct or accessible way. Love in avoidant individuals often exists internally without external translation. They may care deeply, think about the person frequently, or feel strong emotional attachment, yet still struggle to verbalize or act on those emotions in ways others expect. This creates a contradiction. Internal intensity paired with external restraint. From the outside, it looks like disinterest, but internally it may be anything but. The core struggle is not with love itself, but with what love demands. Emotional intimacy requires openness, accountability, and shared emotional space. For someone who associates closeness with vulnerability risk, this can create internal tension. They may want connection, but simultaneously feel the urge to retreat when that connection becomes too emotionally revealing. It is not rejection of the person, but rejection of the feeling of exposure. Because of this, avoidants often develop strategies to manage vulnerability rather than eliminate attachment. They may keep conversations surface level when emotions rise. They may delay responses when they feel emotionally activated. They may create physical or digital distance when intimacy becomes too intense. These behaviors are not necessarily signs that love is gone, they are signs that vulnerability has been triggered. This is why misunderstandings are so common. The partner on the receiving end often interprets withdrawal as loss of interest. But in many cases, the withdrawal happens precisely because interest exists. If there were no emotional investment, there would be no internal conflict. Vulnerability would not feel threatening if nothing mattered. It is the presence of attachment that creates the pressure to step back. Avoidants are also more likely to process emotions internally rather than externally. Instead of expressing fear, longing, or uncertainty, they may analyze it privately or suppress it altogether. This internal processing can make it seem like nothing is happening emotionally, when in reality, a significant amount is being managed beneath the surface. Another key point is that avoidants often show consistency and care through indirect means rather than emotional disclosure. They may remain aware of someone's life, return after silence, or maintain subtle forms of connection without explicitly acknowledging emotional depth. These behaviors reflect attachment, but they avoid the vulnerability of direct expression. The most important insight is that vulnerability is a skill, not a measure of feeling. Someone can love deeply and still lack the emotional tools or internal safety to express that love openly. In avoidant patterns, the emotional system is often intact, but the expression system is restricted. The heart may be engaged, while the behavior remains guarded. So when you see distance, silence, or emotional restraint, it does not automatically mean love is missing. It may mean vulnerability feels unsafe. And for avoidants, the challenge is not whether they can feel love, but whether they can stay open while feeling it. Emotional return patterns reveal unresolved attachment, and this is one of the most reliable indicators of what is still active beneath someone's conscious behavior. In relationships involving avoidant attachment, the surface story often looks like separation, independence, or emotional withdrawal. But the deeper story is written in patterns of return moments when someone re-enters your life, your attention, or your emotional space after distance. These returns are rarely random, even when they appear casual or unplanned. When attachment is fully resolved, a person moves forward in a consistent direction. There is closure in behavior, not just in words. But when emotional attachment remains unresolved, behavior becomes cyclical. There is distance followed by reappearance, silence followed by re-engagement, disconnection followed by curiosity or contact. These cycles are not just habits, they are reflections of an internal system still processing emotional significance. Hughes often emphasizes that behavioral repetition under emotional stress reveals underlying psychological truth. In avoidant dynamics, emotional stress is often tied to separation and intimacy at the same time. The person distances themselves to feel safe, but over time, the emotional bond draws them back. This creates a loop where detachment and attachment operate simultaneously, producing return patterns that feel inconsistent but are actually emotionally driven. An avoidant individual may leave a connection, convince themselves they are fine, and appear to move on. But unresolved attachment does not disappear simply because someone has physically or socially stepped away. Instead, it lingers in the background of their internal world. It may resurface when triggered by memory, loneliness, curiosity, or emotional activation. That is when return patterns begin to appear. These returns are often subtle at first. A message sent after weeks or months of silence. A casual check-in that seems low effort on the surface. A reaction to something you posted. Or even indirect contact through social awareness without direct conversation. To an outside observer, these actions may seem insignificant. But in behavioral terms, re-engagement after distance is highly meaningful because it shows the emotional connection still has influence. Unresolved attachment is revealed not by intensity alone, but by persistence. If someone truly has no emotional tie, they do not need to return. They do not feel compelled to re-enter a space they have fully left behind. But when attachment is still active, even at a low level, the emotional system continues to seek reference points. The mind checks back. It revisits the connection. It tests whether the bond still exists. This is especially true in avoidant patterns where suppression replaces expression. Instead of processing attachment directly, they often push it aside during periods of distance. However, suppression is not resolution. What is not processed tends to resurface later, often through behavior rather than words. The return becomes the expression of what was never fully addressed internally. Return patterns also reveal emotional regulation struggles. An avoidant may feel fine for a period of separation, then suddenly experience a shift in curiosity, nostalgia, or emotional discomfort. That shift leads to re-engagement. But because the underlying attachment was never fully integrated, the cycle repeats. They return, withdraw again, then return again. Each cycle reflects the same unresolved emotional thread. Importantly, these returns are not always conscious attempts to reconnect deeply. Sometimes they are emotional impulses that bypass rational intention. A moment of vulnerability, a memory trigger, or a sense of loss can prompt contact without a long-term plan. But even when unplanned, the behavior still reflects attachment that has not settled. Another key aspect is that return patterns often intensify when finality is sensed. When the other person begins to detach or move forward, the avoidance system can reactivate. Not always because they want control, but because the emotional bond becomes more visible when it feels threatened. That perceived loss creates activation, which leads to reappearance. Ultimately, emotional return patterns are one of the clearest behavioral signatures of unresolved attachment. They show that the connection still exists in some internal form, even if it is not consistently expressed. The relationship may not be stable, and the communication may not be direct, but the repeated return tells a deeper truth. The emotional link was never fully completed, only interrupted. The clearest sign is not words, it's repeated emotional orbiting. And this is where most people finally begin to see the truth behind avoidant attachment patterns. Words are easy to control. People can say they are done, say they are fine, or say they have moved on. But behavior that repeats over time is much harder to fake, especially when it happens under emotional pressure. Emotional orbiting is one of those behaviors that reveals what is still active beneath the surface, even when everything else suggests distance. Emotional orbiting refers to the pattern where someone repeatedly circles back into your emotional space without fully re-engaging in a stable, direct relationship. They may disappear for a period, then reappear briefly. They may not commit, but they do not fully disconnect either. They stay in a kind of psychological proximity, where they are not present but not entirely absent. This in-between state is often where unresolved attachment lives. Hughes often highlights that behavior repetition under emotional tension is far more revealing than verbal explanation. In avoidant dynamics, this becomes especially important because avoidants are often skilled at verbal detachment. They can explain why they need space. They can rationalize distance. They can even convince themselves they are no longer emotionally invested. But if emotional orbiting continues, it suggests the internal attachment system is still active regardless of their narrative. Orbiting is not always obvious at first. It can look like small, inconsistent behaviors. Checking social media stories, reacting to posts without initiating conversation, send. Replying occasional neutral messages or reappearing at emotionally significant moments. On their own, these actions may seem meaningless, but when they repeat over time, a pattern emerges. That pattern shows that the person is still psychologically connected, even if they are not emotionally available in a direct way. What makes orbiting so significant is that it requires ongoing awareness. Someone who is fully detached does not continuously re-enter another person's emotional field. They move on in a linear direction. But someone who orbits is still tracking, still noticing, still responding in subtle ways. This does not always mean conscious intent. Often it is an unconscious pull toward familiarity, unresolved emotion, or internal conflict that has not been resolved through direct communication. In avoidant attachment, orbiting often replaces direct engagement. Instead of fully reconnecting, they hover at the edges. Instead of expressing feelings, they observe. Instead of committing, they test proximity in small, low-risk ways. This allows them to maintain emotional safety while still staying connected at a distance. It becomes a compromise between attachment and avoidance. The emotional meaning behind orbiting becomes clearer when you observe timing. Often these behaviors increase when the other person begins to withdraw or move forward. That shift creates emotional activation. The avoidance system, which may have been quiet, suddenly becomes alert again. Not necessarily because they want full reconnection, but because the loss of emotional access becomes psychologically noticeable. That awareness triggers re-engagement behaviors. Orbiting also reveals something important about memory and emotional storage. Even when avoidants appear detached, the connection is often still recorded internally. They may not talk about it, but they remember it. They may not express it, but they revisit it mentally. Orbiting is often the external reflection of that internal recall process. The person is not fully gone from their emotional map, which is why they continue to appear in subtle ways. Another important aspect is that orbiting does not always lead to action. It can exist for long periods without escalation. Someone can orbit emotionally without ever fully returning. This is what makes it so confusing for the other person. It creates the illusion of proximity without actual relationship stability. It feels like something is still there, but nothing fully forms from it. The strongest misunderstanding is assuming that absence of words equals absence of feeling. But orbiting behavior challenges that assumption. It shows that emotional presence can exist without verbal confirmation. It shows that someone can be distant, inconsistent, or silent, yet still remain psychologically engaged. In the end, emotional orbiting is the clearest sign because it is the most difficult to control consistently over time. Words can be edited. Statements can be controlled. But repeated behavior across time reveals what has not been resolved internally. When someone continues to circle back into your emotional space without fully leaving or fully staying, it often means the attachment was never truly closed. It is still active, still influencing behavior, and still quietly shaping the connection from a distance.